So I guess what my talk is about is, why is Wemyss important in this wider context? So, in terms of Pictish art, but also in terms of wider society. And I guess what's really interesting to me and to scholars of this period is the development of the Picts themselves as one of the early kingdoms of Scotland. And in terms of that longer term story, then that goes back at least to the late 3rd century, when the Picts are first mentioned in late Roman sources, and then they go on to become these powerful series of kingdoms that rule northeast Scotland from at least the 5th, 6th centuries through to the 9th and 10th centuries AD. And I think the symbols are a really important element of that in terms of the formation of a more unified social group and political group as well. And obviously, one of the most iconic and famous elements of the Picts are the symbols. And this is the distribution of these from Fife up to the Northern Isles, a few in the Western Isles as well. And obviously, this is fascinating. What do the symbols mean? What do they represent? What date are they? And these are all kind of fundamental questions that have been debated for over 150 years. So, how can places like Wemyss help us establish the chronology and assess the meaning of these iconic elements of the Picts? Well, in terms of scholarship, we can look at the roots of the study of the Picts and their symbols, going back, I think, really to John Stuart's formative work in the 1860s, an Aberdeenshire boy, who wrote this fantastic series of books called The Sculpture Stones of Scotland. And he was the first really to explicitly associate the symbols with the Picts. So monuments that lie north of the Forth, he recognised they had a geographical basis, and if you relate that to the territories of the Picts and the Pictish kingdoms, then it's a pretty close match. So this is where the idea that these symbols were Pictish in nature and early medieval in date. And there's a whole series of works in the late 19th century. Another seminal volume was Alan and Anderson's in 1903, developing the class system in terms of looking at the type and typology of these monuments, arguing that there were two main types. The class 1 symbols, where you find these symbols by themselves on rough boulders, standing stones, etc. And usually with these paired symbols here, occasionally with the mirror and comb, but the most common motif being these pairs of symbols. And then you also find these on early Christian monuments as well. So Godspeed and Sutherland, and the Christian cross on one side, and the symbols on other. And this kind of established that these are unlikely to be religious symbols in terms of being pagan symbols, because why would you have them on a Christian cross here? So led scholars to suggest there were other reasons, interpretations of the symbols. So there were lots of different interpretations of the symbols through time. As say, Stuart identified them as Pictish, noted that the symbol combinations are rarely repeated, and they're also found quite widely distributed. So it doesn't seem to be any kind of territorial basis to these. They don't seem to be tribal group markings or anything like that. And then there was a whole series of interpretations right through the 19th and 20th century. A few seminal works again into the 20th centuries. Stevenson, 1955. A real proponent for this tradition being really quite late, 7th century or later, and arguing that the Picts were largely following other groups elsewhere, particularly the Anglo-Saxons, arguing that they were seeing these symbols, these motifs in things like manuscript art, and copying that, and also arguing that the most complex symbols were the earliest, and these kind of tended to break down through time. So actually arguing for the kind of opposite of what you might expect in an archaeological context, i.e. usually things start off simple and they get more complex through time. But this was a very influential study, and was influential right through to the kind of late 20th century. And then moving forward in time again, people began to have different conceptions of what the symbols were. And I think a really key work was Samson's study in 1992 that argued that the symbol traditionally was a naming system. So he again noted the kind of pairing of the symbols, i.e. whatever message they are conveying must be quite simple. It's not like hieroglyphs where you have long strings of these symbols. You only have one or two symbols again. And arguing that they were a naming tradition that represented Pictish names. And this was followed by Catherine Forsyth in 1997, who argued that again this was some form of script and it was for representing the Pictish language. And then some more recent work, Lee and his group using modelling to suggest that again the most likely interpretation of the symbols is some sort of naming written system. And if you study the monuments themselves, you can actually see that this is probably very likely. So places like Dunfermline, cross slab here, you can see individuals on chairs or seats or possibly thrones with pairs of symbols next to them here. So seemingly identifying these individuals, at least some sort of status or rank, or again, most likely the name of these individuals here. So that's one major element of the symbols, and what do they mean? And most recent scholarship is kind of centred on them being some sort of naming system, and I think that's probably likely. But dating, again, this has been debated since the 19th century. There's almost, before our work, there were very few absolute dates, and there were very few parallels to go on. It was all based on art history. This symbol looks a bit like this piece of metalwork, this symbol looks like something found in manuscript sources, but obviously that's very, very subjective. So really what archaeologists can do and what archaeology can provide is the possibility for absolute dating, for scientific dating of these traditions. And this was the only real glimmer of an absolute chronology was National Museum radiocarbon dated this bone object from Orkney, from a settlement context, with these symbols on them. You can see the symbol here, it's got lots of internal decorations. It's probably one of the more kind of complicated designs as these things go. And they dated this to 570 to 655 AD, so 6th century or early 7th century. So kind of tying in with what people like Stevenson said, 6th, 7th century in date. There were a few other places that had absolute dates. This is Dairy Park in Sutherland again, where this beautiful stone here, again with quite complex design. You see all this internal decoration for the snake, and this symbol here, much more complicated than the designs it weaves. And this stone was found above a cairn, an individual in here had 2 radiocarbon dates, which were pretty useless actually. It's quite early radiocarbon dates, and they suggested that this was somewhere between 600 AD and 1150 AD, so almost useless to be honest. But we can revisit these samples and we can redate them. So we set out a couple of years ago really to try and get as many absolute and contextual dates for the symbols, to try and build a much more robust chronology for this tradition. You know, when does it start? When does it end? How does it develop through time? So there weren't many objects really left we could look at. There's a couple of bone objects from, again, the Northern Isles up in Orkney, where there tends to be better bone survival in sites. This cattle bone had a crescent here. You can see it's quite simple. There's no internal decoration. And also this bone pin with remains of a double disc and a crescent. Quite similar to the Wemyss design, you see, with just the simple decoration here. So we were able to date this object here. This was too small to sample, but we were able to model the layers, the settlement layers in which this had been found. And then what we also looked at was sites where there were symbols that were argued to be early in the tradition. So again, you know, there's different interpretations of Wemyss. One possible interpretation is that these are relatively early in the tradition of Pictish carving. Likewise, at Dunacare in Aberdeenshire, there was a series of stones, very similar carving style, on small stones. You know, can we revisit these sites and try and again get, you know, we can't date the stones, we can't date the cave walls, at least not yet. But can we date the settlement remains associated with it, and does that give us an indication of the chronology of these monuments? And then we've been working on other sites where we've also been doing this as well. So this is Riney up in Aberdeenshire, which has a whole series of symbol stones, big, beautiful standing stone monuments with very beautifully carved symbols, but again, relatively simple in terms of their decoration. And we've been working on a settlement site with symbol stones where they have been found within the settlement. So, these are the results from our project, which we've managed to obtain so far. So we dated this bone here from the settlement pool, and we dated that to most likely probability 420 to 540 AD. So it's already pushed it back, you know, a century or so compared to the only other absolute dated object. So into the 5th century, early 6th century at the latest. And then this object here from the settlement layers, you see those layers also date 425 to 575 AD. So again, 5th, 6th century. So again, pushing the chronology back for these symbols back into that kind of immediate post-Roman period. And then we dated the burial, redated the burial with this you know, really beautiful, elaborate series of symbols here. And this came back as 575 to 625 AD. So late 6th century, early 7th century. So simple symbols, earlier dates, more complex symbols, later dates. And somewhere between the 5th century and the early 7th century at the latest. So we're beginning to push the chronology back towards that kind of immediate post-Roman period. Can we push it even further back? And this is where places like Wemyss and Dunacare comes into the mix. So these are the stones from Dunacare. Quite unusual symbols in terms of quite elaborate elements to them, but the main symbols themselves are very simple outlines with no internal decoration to them. And these were found on that fantastic promontory that Joe gave you a picture of, and they were found by a bunch of youths digging for gold on top of the sea stack, but they didn't find them. And this is the stack today. Basically, there's not much left of it. It's another site that's been seriously compromised by coastal erosion. So we reckon, you know, there's maybe only 25% of the site left compared to what it would have been in the Pictish period. And what we found was that the stones are described in the 19th century as coming from a low stone wall around the edge of the sea stack. And we found the remains of that, timber elements here, and a stone facing, not much left of it, because actually, believe it or not, the stone from the stack was actually quarried in the 19th century to build the houses in Stonehaven. But quite remarkable archaeology inside. We found houses, hearths, floor layers from buildings inside. Here you can see two hearths here. This is an earlier hearth replaced by this one. And then all this kind of black muddy stuff is actually floor layers from settlements on top of the stack here. And then on the what we call the lower side delta is like not much bigger than this area here. Again, we found multiple hearths here built on top of one another. So very intensive settlement on what looks like a really unpromising site today. But there are multiple hearths. Again, many of them were truncated by erosion from the loss of the site. So here's the stack today, and you can see that there's much bigger outline. This is actually recorded as a stack in the first edition map here. So clearly, again, it's a much bigger site than survives today. And what we think this was is a promontory fort, a bit like what we're testing to see if there's something similar at Weeds. And it was obviously densely occupied, and the people living on the site were really well connected. So we find really unusual bits and pieces of Roman material culture that goes back to the 1st century through to the 3rd century AD. And this is incredibly unusual in Aberdeenshire. So this is miles and miles north of the Roman frontier. So they were clearly connected to trading or even raiding the Roman Empire to get this Roman material. And then signs of wealth as well, metalworking tools, furnishing stones, and again, clear evidence of people actually living on the site. So there's quern stones for grinding grain, spindle whorls for winding yarn. And what was most exciting and quite remarkable about the site was the dates for the settlement. So I presume that this was going to be 5th century or later, as most of these promontory forts are. But it's actually a site that began somewhere in the 2nd or 1st century AD, so that's 200 AD, and ended by 400 AD. So starting 160 to 220, and the rampart from which the stones are said to have been recovered in the 19th century, so therefore it should give us a relative date for the stones themselves, is dated to 285 to 350 AD, so in the late Roman period. And this is not definite conclusive proof that the stones date from this period. It's a pretty convincing case, I think, to be made here that these stones are actually dating to that late Roman period. Which makes us look at the other sites, where we have these relatively simple carvings. What date are these? And if we actually look at the context of the archaeological material that's been recovered from these caves, it's quite interesting. So the Cowsea Cave, up in the Murray Coast, there's nothing later than the 4th century AD from these caves. Again, it doesn't necessarily date the carvings, but it seems likely the carvings were made within a settlement context, some sort of use of the caves. And what's really interesting about the Cowsea material is again, it's not your everyday material. Well, there is evidence for a settlement, but there's also some really unusual stuff. There's a huge amount of late Roman materials, the biggest collection of late Roman material. Again, really far north of the frontier, really unusual. And there's also some evidence for, some pretty grisly evidence as well, for decapitation of people in the 4th century in a Roman style, i.e. they're beheaded with a sword. So it smacks of high status people occupying these caves and getting up to some rather naughty things, killing enemies perhaps. And then this is where the date from the Slimy Cave is also really quite intriguing, because there's nothing, well, only a single radiocarbon date, but the time team dig found this settlement layer with dates from the 3rd, 4th century, and above that there's nothing but kind of inwash and storm events. So there's no evidence of the use of this particular cave after the 4th century. So really that's our question for the next few days is, can we get more material from that layer, get some more radiocarbon dates, and does it help us date those carvings? Again, that's the question. In terms of other sites we've been working on, this is Rhynie in Aberdeenshire. Clearly a high status site, so its place name means a place associated with a great king. And lo and behold, you've got lots of these symbol carvings, the biggest concentration of these class 1 standing stones, including ones that come from known contexts. So the crossing still stands in situ here, and the Rhynie man came from just down slope from this one. And again, symbols that are very simple in style and actually on quite small stones, a bit like the one here on this particular example. And we know very well now what the context of these stones are. And again, they come from a settlement, a high state settlement and a fortified settlement. So these were located within a palisade, a big, huge wooden enclosure with buildings inside. Here you can maybe just make out some. These are timber buildings, so they're quite hard to recover. And there's no question about the status of the people who are living at this site, surrounded by all these beautiful standing stones with Pictish carvings on. These were elites. These were the high status people within society. They were drinking Mediterranean wine. They were wearing fancy jewellery, things like cloak pins and brooch pins. They were receiving imports of glass drinking vessels from Western France. And they were making objects which are quite remarkable for the period. They are very similar to some of the symbols you find on the stones themselves. So that we have little axe pins like this that look very similar to the axe that the Rhynie man carries. We have evidence for high status production of brooches and handpins, ingot molds, and again producing objects that you see on the symbols themselves. So this is a little mold here for a hound. This is front leg, this is eye, this is tail, this is back leg. Very, very similar to the hounds or the wolves you find on the symbol stones. So we've got very direct connections here. So I don't think there's any doubt that the stones date to the same period as the settlement. And in fact, there's loads of these molds from Rhynie, about a dozen of these different animals as well, which is quite interesting. Again, they come from this settlement context. And the dates for this starts in the 4th century. So again, in that very late Roman context, and some of the material culture is quite late Roman in style. And it goes through to the early 6th century. So these symbols, these big standing stone monuments with these beautiful carvings, but again, relatively simple symbol forms, must date earlier than 560 AD. And we have dating material from a socket for one of these standing stones. So again, it kind of pushes the chronology further back in time. So what does this all mean in terms of the broader system? I think we can't have any doubt that this symbol tradition was in place by the 5th, the early 6th century. And by that time, they were carving big standing stone monuments in association with elite settlements. But I think there's a strong case to suggest that the kind of more simple tradition of these symbols are actually earlier in date, and probably going back into the late Roman period, 3rd and 4th centuries AD. And what we have, rather than Stevenson's system where you have the most complex symbols actually degenerate through time, you have a much more standard typological development from small undecorated symbols developing through time into much more artistic and complicated motifs, which culminates with some incredibly elaborate symbols with things like interlace, early Christian motifs within the symbols themselves or next to the symbols. And those ones are probably going through to the 8th, 9th centuries in date. But this tradition, certainly going back to the 5th century, probably into the 3rd and 4th centuries. So you're talking about a tradition that endured for at least 400 years, probably 500, 600 years. So it's an incredibly long tradition. And the beauty is we're beginning to be able to pin down that chronology in a much more detailed level than we ever could before. And that's through radiocarbon dating, Bayesian modelling, and digging sites, which is a very traditional standard technique. But there's been very few Pictish sites actually dug on a big scale, and it's only through doing that that we can actually provide that absolute chronology for these sites. So if we think about the development of the system in that wider context, what does this say about the origin of this tradition? Well, I think what's most likely is that it's originating in that late Roman period. And that seems the most likely period for contact with literate societies. You've got the Romans on your doorstep. We know the Picts are raiding, they're trading with the Romans, and they're clearly seeing objects, monuments that have inscriptions on them. And it seems to me that that's the most likely context for developing your own system of recording things like names in this late Roman and immediate post-Roman context. And it also puts the Picts on a much more equal footing with other societies across northwest Europe. So, why would the Pictish symbols be so late when things like Ogham in Ireland, that seems to be developing in the 3rd, 4th centuries, at the latest, the runic tradition in Scandinavia, much farther away from the frontier, developing from at least the 2nd century onwards. So it looks like the Picts are part of this wider European tradition of people on the fringes of the Roman world developing their own system for recording their own language. And in terms of function, what are these things doing? Well, I don't think there's any one function for these, because they're found in burial context, they're found in settlement context, they're probably also marking territory and land, and it's designed to be a system, I think, to communicate identity to the wider world, and developing that tradition through contact, as say, with these more literate societies further south. And what's really interesting, if we push that system back in time, as we're suggesting, then what does that say about the Picts themselves? Well, there's been a lot of talk recently about the Pictish identity, the Pictish kingdoms emerging really quite late, 7th century or later. But if we have this shared system of representing identity, a form of writing representing names, going back at least to the 5th, 6th centuries, and perhaps into that late Roman period, it suggests that kind of formation of that Pictish identity language is going back into that late Roman period. And funnily enough, that's when that term is coined. It's in the late 3rd century. The Romans coined this new term, the Picts. Clearly it meant something, I think. It meant a change in society north of the frontier. These societies are coming together, they're raiding the Roman Empire on a scale that's really unprecedented. And I think, again, it's that proximity of an empire on your doorstep that leads to this real development of all these different cultural traditions happening. So that's me. You can read all about it. Development of the Pictish symbol system. It's in an academic journal that's open access, so anyone can read it. A journal called Antiquity. And let me know what you think. And we'll keep you posted about what happens in sliding cave. So just started today, and we're down to the level that Time Team stopped at in 2004, and we've got lots of nice charcoal and bone down about a metre below the floor of the current cave just now. And what's really, I think, really interesting about that is that it's an obvious, where the carvings are in the sliding cave today, you'd have to be basically lying on the floor to carve them. But if you're down at that level where the 3rd, 4th century material is, they're just about at this height where you can carve them. So it's not totally secure yet, but I think the evidence hopefully will allow us to build up more of a picture of Wemyss Caves, sliding cave, and hopefully who knows what we're going to find in other caves as well. So watch this space, and thanks for listening.